You just heard me read King and Kayla in the Case of Found Fred, and that book is an example of what we're calling a transitional book. So transitional books serve as bridges between what we call easy books for young children who are first learning how to read and chapter books that are intended for older children who can read proficiently and independently. So transitional books are meant to fill that gap between those two spectrums of children, like the very beginning readers and the strong independent readers. Um, so as you probably noticed as you listen to me read from King and Kayla in the Case of Found Fred, many of these transitional books have certain features that distinguish them from many of the other chapter books that you've read this semester. For example, King and Kayla is very different in how it's set up from other books like George or Ephraim Divided and some of the literature circle books that you've read, right? Like a lot of those books have a lot more text on the page. They tend to be fairly long, around 200 pages or more. But transitional books tend to be a lot shorter. King and Kayla is only 48 pages. And that's fairly common to see with these transitional books. So they have a shorter length, but they also tend to have shorter chapters. So instead of 20 or 30 page chapters like we see in a lot of chapter books for older children, in these transitional books we tend to see chapters that are only about 6 to 8 pages in length. And we actually see fewer chapters in the books themselves. Like King and Kayla in the Case of Found Fred has only 5 chapters versus 15 or 20 chapters or whatever you might see in a chapter book for older students. So oftentimes in transitional books, the sentences tend to be very short and direct so as not to overwhelm children who are still gaining independence as readers. Oftentimes in these transitional books, we see illustrations that accompany the text, but we wouldn't exactly call them picture books because the illustrations aren't necessarily synthesized with the text in the same way that we would see with some of the picture books that we've looked at earlier in the semester. But they do have pictures to elaborate on some of what the text is saying. But I feel like they're more text heavy than picture heavy in comparison to many of the picture books that we've looked at in this class. So transitional books also have controlled vocabulary. So they have a limited number of words that tend to be unfamiliar to young children who are still developing their proficiency as readers. Usually the font size in transitional books is larger, so we might see fonts that are 14 or 16 font or higher versus I want to say 12 font is pretty common in many of the other chapter books that we've read so far this semester. And transitional books also have more white space on the page, and that's so that readers can rest their eyes and they're not overwhelmed by seeing all that text on the page. And we see some of these examples certainly from King and Kayla in the Case of Found Fred, but certainly there are many other examples of transitional books. For example, some of the books in the I Can Read series, especially at like levels 1 and 2, are examples of books for transitional readers. Penny and Her Marble is one that won an award that looks like the Geisel Honor, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in this Nearpod. But that's an award for books for beginning readers. But you see some of these features here, right? Like these sentences are very short. They only extend onto 2 lines, and the sentences are, they don't go across the whole page. They're only kind of centered in the page. So there's a lot of white space surrounding the sentences, and we have an illustration to accompany the text that we see here. So the features that we see here on this example of a page from Penny and Her Marble is pretty typical of what we see in transitional books. Another example, I don't know if you've ever seen the Humphrey books, but Humphrey is a classroom hamster. And there's a series for older children called something like The Adventures of Humphrey. But the author has also written a series for younger children called Humphrey's Tiny Tales. So, for kids who are in the primary grades, they might prefer to read Humphrey's Tiny Tales, whereas the upper elementary students might prefer the Adventures of Humphrey books, which are longer and more typical of a chapter book. So as you probably guessed from listening to this, transitional books are meant for children who are developing their independence as readers. They know how to decode and comprehend, but they're not ready quite yet for lengthy chapter books like many of the ones we've read together this semester. So oftentimes transitional books are aimed at children in the primary grades, meaning kids in first grade, second grade, and third grade who are becoming independent as readers.